I was recently talking to a trade attaché from a mid-sized Southeast Asian nation, someone who's, spent his entire career navigating the friction between Washington and Beijing. We were sitting in this glass-walled office looking out over a really bustling port, and he pointed out something fascinating. On one pier, you have a U.S. Navy destroyer docked for a routine port call, a clear symbol of security cooperation. But then, just a few hundred yards away, these massive cranes, branded with Chinese state-owned logos, were offloading crates of telecommunications gear, stuff destined for the country's new 5G network. And he had this slight, knowing smile as he checked his watch and remarked how convenient it was that his country was being courted by both sides. To an outsider, it just looked like a precarious balancing act, or maybe even a slow-motion betrayal of his Western allies. I mean, in Washington, this would be whispered about as a tilt toward Beijing, right? A sign that the U.S. was losing the region. There's this palpable anxiety in the air every time a country like his takes a meeting in China, a feeling that they're one signature away from, switching jerseys and joining the other team. But then he said something that completely flipped the script for me. I asked him, "Are you worried? Worried about the pressure from the U.S. regarding those Chinese tech contracts?" He didn't look worried at all. In fact, he looked energized. He said, "Why would I be?" He asked, "The more the U.S. worries we're leaning toward China, the better the trade terms they offer us to stay. And the more we work with the U.S. on security, the more Beijing lowers its infrastructure interest rates to keep us at the table." And that's when it hit me. We've been looking at the world through the lens of a high-stakes football match where you have to wear either a red or blue jersey. We see every single move as a pivot or a loss. But for the rest of the world, the game has changed entirely. They aren't looking for a new master. They're looking for room to breathe. They aren't choosing a side. They're creating what he called a thread of exit. This isn't a story about a new Cold War. It's a story about the rise of the ultimate insurance policy. Strategic optionality.
Strategic optionality. It's a dense phrase, isn't it? It sounds like something you'd find buried in a risk management textbook or maybe a hedge fund prospectus. But what you just described, that attaché looking at a U.S. destroyer and a Chinese crane and seeing opportunity rather than conflict, that right there is the defining geopolitical shift of our decade.
But let's be honest for a second here. To me, strategic optionality sounds a lot like a polite way of saying playing both sides. Or maybe just opportunism. Is this actually a strategy, or is it just nations grabbing whatever cash is on the table before, things get messy? Because for the last 5 years, honestly, all I've heard about is decoupling. The narrative has been that the world is splitting into two very distinct blocks, an American bloc and a Chinese bloc, and everyone has to pick a team.
That narrative of decoupling is incredibly popular in Washington and Beijing, for that matter. It fits on a bumper sticker. But if you actually look at the data, the shipping manifests, the currency flows, the patent filings, it's wrong. The world isn't splitting. It's meshing.
Meshing.
Yeah, meshing. Think of it like a net. If you cut the net in half, that's decoupling. Simple. But what we are seeing is the net getting denser. Countries and companies are deliberately weaving more connections to more nodes to ensure that if one string breaks, the whole thing doesn't just fall apart. That attaché you met isn't being disloyal. He's being resilient. He knows that if he relies 100% on the U.S. for security and 100% on China for trade, he has zero leverage. He is what we'd call a price taker.
He's a captive audience. Yeah. And nobody wants to be a captive audience when the landlord decides to jack up the rent.
Exactly. Strategic optionality is the deliberate cultivation of alternatives. It is the ability to look a superpower in the eye and say, I have other options. Yeah. And today, we're going to tear this concept apart, layer by layer. We aren't just going to talk theory. We're going to look at the real mechanics of it.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, we need to look at the physical layer, how ports are actually being wired together. Then, the corporate layer, how companies like Toyota and Intel are physically restructuring their factories to survive this. And then we need to look at the financial and digital layers, because that's where the real battle for the underlying plumbing is happening.
And the mission here for us is to figure out if this is sustainable, because honestly, it feels fragile to me. Walking a tightrope is great until a gust of wind comes along.
It is fragile, and it's incredibly difficult.
But
the alternative, total dependency on one power, is turning out to be much, much worse.
Okay, so let's get into the physical reality of this. Because grand strategy is fine, but at the end of the day, a physical box has to go on a physical ship and go somewhere.
The physical layer. Exactly. Yeah. The world of steel and concrete.
I was scrolling through some field footage for my next video, and I came across the story of a man named Eris, a logistics supervisor at a really bustling port in Surabaya. And you have to try to imagine the heat of East Java, right? Where the air is just thick with salt and the sound of heavy machinery never ever stops. Eris remembers a time when waiting for a slot meant days of idling ships and, for him, lost revenue. But recently, things changed. I heard that his terminal underwent this massive overhaul, and get this, it was financed through China's Belt and Road initiatives, but it's being managed under the regulatory streamlining of the RCEP. So Eris doesn't see himself as some kind of pawn in a great power game. To him, the strategic optionality we talk about in these, geopolitical circles looks like a new crane that actually works and a digital tracking system that can talk to partners from Tokyo all the way to Beijing. He watched as the port's throughput literally doubled. He told a local reporter that for the first time, his team isn't choosing between American standards or Chinese speed, they're simply choosing efficiency. And my take on this, when we analyze these high-level trade blocks, we often forget that for people like Eris, state capacity isn't some abstract concept. It's the sound of a container locking into place every 30 seconds instead of every 30 minutes. It's the physical proof that when a nation refuses to pick a side, it gains the power to pick the best of both worlds.
That sound, the container locking into place, that's the metric that matters. But let's unpack why that crane is there. You mentioned two acronyms that people, I think, usually gloss over. BRI and RCEP.
The Belt and Road Initiative and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
Right. Now, in the West, we often view these as purely political tools. We say, oh, China is just buying influence with the Belt and Road. Look, that's true. But for a country like Indonesia, the BRI is just the hardware store. It's where they got the capital for the dredging and the cranes, the physical stuff. But the RCEP, that's the software. That's the operating system.
Okay, I always get the RCEP mixed up with the other ones. That's the massive trade deal, the one that notably excludes the U.S., right?
It includes the 10 ASEAN nations, plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. I mean, you're talking about almost a third of the world's population under one agreement. But here's the really critical detail. RCEP standardizes the rules of origin. Well, before RCEP, if you were a factory in Indonesia, you had completely different paperwork for shipping a product to Japan than you did for shipping the same product to China. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, a mess of red tape. RCEP unified that. It created a single standard. So Eris's port works because they used Chinese money to build a capacity and then they used a multinational treaty to streamline the flow of goods. That's the software.
Okay, but I want to push back on this Chinese money part a little bit. If China is paying for the port expansion in Surabaya, surely they own the port, right? Or at least a big piece of it. We've all heard the stories about debt trap diplomacy. Isn't Indonesia just selling its sovereignty for a few nice cranes?
That is the common critique, and a valid one, based on early examples. Historically, yes, there have been cases like the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, where unsustainable debt led to equity swaps, basically handing over the keys. But the data coming out now shows that ASEAN nations are getting a lot smarter. They're learning to negotiate much harder. They aren't just handing over sovereignty anymore. They are using this strategic optionality we're talking about to ensure that the port serves their network, not just Beijing's. And this leads us to a really fascinating concept in network theory called port centrality.
Port centrality, is that just a fancy way of saying who's the busiest?
Exactly. There are different ways to measure busy. You can have something called degree centrality, which is basically just how many ships you handle. By that measure, Singapore is the undisputed king. But the metric that really matters for optionality, for true influence, is eigenvector centrality.
Okay, you're definitely going to have to explain that one.
Think of it like social popularity in high school. You could be popular because you talk to 100 random people. That's degree centrality. It's just volume. Or you could be popular because you are best friends with the 3 most popular, most influential people in the entire school. That is eigenvector centrality. It measures how well connected you are to other well-connected nodes.
Okay, so it's not just about volume, it's about the quality of your connections. It's about who you're talking to.
And we are seeing a major shift in the hierarchy of Asian ports. At the top, in layer 1, you have the mega hub ports, Singapore, Shanghai, Kaohsiung, in Taiwan. They basically control the flow. But underneath them, down in what we call layer 3, we're seeing a huge surge in potential ports, places like Kai Mep in Vietnam and Batangas or Subic Bay in the Philippines.
Wait, Vietnam and the Philippines. Those are the two countries that are currently having the most aggressive, almost daily standoffs with China in the South China Sea. We are seeing videos of Coast Guard ships ramming each other, water cannons being fired, and you're telling me they are simultaneously integrating their ports into a Chinese-led shipping network. Victory.
If you only read the geopolitical headlines, you'd think trade between Vietnam and China should be grinding to a halt. But if you look at the shipping data, the port of CIPS is aggressively expanding its capacity specifically to handle Chinese feeder vessels.
Why?
Because economic pragmatism overrides political friction. Vietnam knows that if they want to be a global manufacturing powerhouse, they need raw materials and components from China. They simply cannot afford to cut that line. It would be economic suicide.
So the diplomats are shouting at each other on Monday, and the port managers are signing contracts and loading cargo on Tuesday.
Correct. And by building up a port like CIPS, Vietnam creates a credible threat of exit. If Singapore becomes too expensive, or if the Strait of Malacca becomes politically or physically choked, Vietnam now has a world-class deep-water port that can ship directly to Europe or the U.S.
They're building a fire escape. That's a fire escape. You don't build a fire escape because you plan to burn the building down. You build it because you don't fully trust the landlord to keep the wiring up to code.
And this fire escape mentality isn't just for governments. It's happening right now inside the boardrooms of the world's biggest companies. And that brings us to the economic layer.
Right, because if you're a CEO right now, say you're running a massive car company or chip manufacturer, you have to be sweating. You see the tariffs, you see the sanctions. You can't just put your factory wherever labor is cheapest anymore and call it a day. That model is broken.
It's totally broken. The old model was just-in-time efficiency. Get parts to the factory door the moment you need them. The new model is just-in-case resilience. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, released a report recently that uses a framework they call foundations and enablers. It essentially asks, how do you plant a flag in a country so deeply that you can actually survive a geopolitical storm?
You know, one of the examples that really stood out to me in the research for this was Toyota. Now, Toyota's been in Thailand for a long, long time, right? Since the 60s.
Yes, they've been there forever. People call Thailand the Detroit of Asia, largely because of Toyota. But what's so interesting is how they've evolved their presence there versus, say, their operations in Kentucky in the USA. It's not just about stamping out car parts anymore. It's about the APGPC.
The Asia-Pacific Global Production Center. It sounds remarkably boring, I have to say.
It sounds incredibly boring, but it's a strategic weapon. The APGPC isn't a factory. It's basically a university for advanced manufacturing. Toyota trains its best engineers and line workers there, not just for the Thai market, but to then go out and support Toyota affiliates in 8 other economies across the region.
So they are exporting knowledge. They're exporting human capital, not just cars.
Exactly. By doing this, Toyota embeds itself into the very fabric of Thailand's human capital. Now, think about the leverage that creates for them. If the Thai government changes, or if there is some regional crisis, Toyota isn't just seen as a foreign company extracting profit. They are the primary educator of the nation's entire industrial workforce. That's a powerful position to be in.
It creates what you'd call a domestic capability flywheel. The more they teach, the more valuable they become to the host country.
Yes. And think about it from a resilience perspective. If a supply chain breaks, say, a critical parts factory in Japan goes offline because of an earthquake or a blockade, the workforce in Thailand is skilled enough to adapt, to retool, and find local solutions. They aren't just following instructions on a sheet of paper. They understand the fundamental engineering. That is true corporate optionality.
But that kind of training takes years. It's got to be incredibly expensive. Does the payoff really justify the cost compared to just hopping to the next cheap labor market when things get tough?
In a stable, predictable world, not. But in a volatile world like ours, absolutely. And look at Intel. They are playing an even more complex, more high-stakes game in Southeast Asia. We talk about the chip war constantly, but you have to look at Intel's CIPS+1 strategy in Vietnam to see the future.
CIPS+1. Another one of these acronyms.
It stands for Competitive Semiconductor Ecosystem Within a Specific Time Frame, +1. The +1 is the key. It basically means don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't rely on a single node. Intel has invested billions of dollars into Vietnam, specifically for something called advanced packaging.
Okay, pause. I need you to explain advanced packaging like I'm 5 years old. Because when I hear packaging, I think of cardboard boxes and bubble wrap. I assume this is not that.
Laughs. No, it is definitely not bubble wrap.
Yeah.
Okay, think of a traditional computer chip like a sprawling suburb.
A suburb. Okay.
You have the memory over here, the processor way over there, and they're all connected by these long roads, which are the wires. It takes time for the electrons to travel down those roads, and it takes up a lot of physical space. Advanced packaging, specifically these new technologies like Intel's Foveros 3D, is like building a skyscraper instead of a suburb.
You're stacking the chips, you're going vertical.
You are stacking them vertically. You put the memory right on top of the processor. This makes it unbelievably fast because the commute for the electrons is now just a short elevator ride instead of a crosstown drive.
And it saves space, I imagine.
But imagine the engineering challenge of a skyscraper versus a suburb. The heat management, the structural integrity, the microscopic connections between floors. It is incredibly high-tech, cutting-edge stuff.
So Intel is moving this high-tech skyscraper construction to Vietnam.
But, and this is the key, they are keeping other critical functions, like the high-end design and R&D in Malaysia and the US. They are knitting the region together. They're creating a mesh where Vietnam does the packaging, Malaysia does some design, Costa Rica does testing and validation.
So if the US puts new export controls on China, or if China restricts rare earth exports that are needed somewhere, Intel has a distributed network. They aren't stuck. No single point of failure.
Correct. But there's a softer side to this corporate resilience too, which I find just as interesting. It's not all high-tech. Sometimes it's about deep cultural integration. We saw this with two Japanese companies, Kaneka and Ajinomoto, in Malaysia.
Ajinomoto, the food seasoning company, MSG.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And Kaneka, a massive chemical manufacturer. They realized that to be truly secure in Malaysia, a Muslim-majority country, they needed more than a business license. They needed a social license to operate. So they invested heavily, very heavily, in making their supply chains and production facilities strictly halal compliant.
Which makes total sense for Ajinomoto selling food, but does a chemical company really need to be halal?
It's about trust. It's about demonstrating a long-term commitment. By aligning with local values, whether that's halal certification or meeting national green energy goals, they make themselves indispensable. They aren't viewed as foreign exploiters, just there for cheap labor. They're viewed as partners in the national project. That stickiness is a form of defense. It makes it very, very hard for a populist politician to come along and say, let's kick them out.
So we've got ports that trade with everyone. That's the physical layer. We've got factories that are embedded so deep they can't be easily evicted, the corporate layer. But none of this moves without money. And this is where I start to get skeptical. Because you can build all the ports and factories you want, but if you can't get paid, you're dead in the water. And for the last, 80 years, getting paid has meant one thing: the US dollar.
The financial layer. This is the nervous system of the global economy. Right, for decades, there was only one nervous system: SWIFT and the dollar clearing banks in New York City.
And if the US government wanted to shut you down, they'd just pinch that nerve and you were paralyzed.
We call that weaponized interdependence. The U.S. realized that because everyone was connected to the dollar, they could enforce foreign policy through the banking system. They did this incredibly effectively with Iran. They cut them off from SWIFT, and the Iranian economy basically went into cardiac arrest overnight.
Which I think brings us to a story about someone who watched that happen from not too far away and decided she did not want to be next. I recently saw a series of posts from a small business owner in Cairo named Farah, who exports high-quality Egyptian cotton, famous stuff. For years, her biggest headache wasn't the quality of her thread, but the volatility of the dollar, and, more importantly, the looming shadow of Western sanctions that could just freeze her transactions if her buyers happened to be in the wrong jurisdiction. But with the expansion of BRICS plus FIRE, Farah's world shifted. I read that she recently completed her first major shipment to a partner in the UAE using a non-dollar settlement system facilitated by this new BRICS financial infrastructure. She described it as, and I'm quoting here, breathing for the first time without looking over her shoulder. This isn't just about economics for her, it's a collective survival strategy. Watching her story unfold, I realized that for many in the global south, Western financial hegemony isn't just a political slogan, it's a real, tangible bottleneck in their daily lives. So while some people might view this move away from the dollar with skepticism or, political concern, from Farah's perspective, it's just about resilience. As a commentator, I look at this and I see a middle power cartel in action. They aren't trying to destroy the old system, they're simply building a fire escape. And it's hard to argue with a merchant who just wants a secure way to be paid for her hard work.
Farah is the perfect example because she is not a bad actor. She's not laundering money for terrorists or trying to evade taxes. She's selling cotton. But the collateral damage of U.S. sanctions policy has created this global climate of fear. Even if you aren't the target, you worry that you might become one, or that your bank might just flag a perfectly normal transaction to be safe, freezing your funds for months.
So she's opting out. But how real is this BRICS financial infrastructure? We hear about de-dollarization constantly, usually from people selling gold or crypto online. But when I travel, everyone still wants dollars. Is FARA really getting paid in rubles or yuan? I'm skeptical.
It's not about replacing the dollar as a store of value. Not yet, anyway. FARA probably still keeps her savings in dollars or maybe gold. This is about the payment rails. It's about the plumbing.
Rails versus value.
Okay, think of it like a messaging app. You might prefer using WhatsApp, because most people are on it. That's the dollar system. But if WhatsApp decides to ban you, or if their server goes down, you immediately install Telegram or Signal as a backup. That is what systems like CIPS are. They're the Telegram for global finance.
CIPS is the cross-border interbank payment system. That's the Chinese alternative to SWIFT, right?
Roughly, yes. It was originally built just to settle trades in the Chinese renminbi. But look at the adoption curve. It now has over 4,900 participating institutions in 187 different jurisdictions.
187 jurisdictions. That's basically the entire planet.
Yes. Now, I want to be very clear about this. CIPS is still clunky compared to SWIFT. It's smaller, it has less liquidity, it's harder to use. If you have a choice, you use SWIFT every time. But if SWIFT kicks you out, CIPS is a life raft.
So it's not trying to be a direct competitor. It's designed as a redundancy, a backup system.
Exactly. And with the expansion of BRICS, adding Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, they are trying to formalize this redundancy. They're building platforms like BRICS Pay and BRICS Clear. And the explicit goal is to create a legal and technical zone where U.S. law simply does not apply.
This is what you were calling governance decoupling.
If a transaction happens on BRICS Clear, settled in Emirati dirhams or Chinese yuan, using their own proprietary messaging system, a judge in New York has no jurisdiction and, crucially, no technical way to stop it.
But doesn't this just fracture the global economy? I mean, efficiency comes from having one standard, one language. If everyone uses the dollar, trade is almost frictionless. If we have 5 different currency blocks with 5 different systems, doesn't that just add a ton of friction and cost back into the system?
It absolutely adds friction. It is less efficient. But FARA and the nations that are representing her interests are willing to pay that efficiency cost in exchange for security and autonomy. They're engaging in what we call dual stacking.
Dual stack?
Like carrying 2 phones. You have your blue jersey phone for dealing with the West, using the dollar system. And you have your red jersey phone for dealing with the rest, using these new rails. It's cumbersome, sure, but it ensures you never completely lose service. And we are seeing the RMB's share of global trade finance rising significantly, even if its share of global reserves is still tiny. It's being used as a utility token for trade, not as an investment asset to hold.
So the dollar isn't dying, it's just losing its monopoly on the plumbing.
Correct. And once you lose the monopoly on the plumbing, you lose the ability to sanction unilaterally and have it be a death sentence. That is the strategic shift.
Okay, this brings us to the final layer, and probably the one that feels the most like science fiction to a lot of people. The digital layer. The tech stack.
This is where all the splinternet fears come from. The idea that we will have a Western internet powered by Google and Amazon and a Chinese internet powered by Tencent and Alibaba, and they won't talk to each other.
I see this debate all the time. Don't use Huawei gear because they'll spy on you. Don't use the American cloud because the NSA will spy on you. It really feels like nations are being forced to choose their fundamental operating system.
That is absolutely the pressure being applied from both sides. But let's look at what the innovators on the ground, the people actually building things, are doing.
There's this fascinating story circulating in the tech hubs of Kuala Lumpur about a young developer named Taufik. And try to imagine his workspace. He's running these complex AI simulations on a server rack that uses high-end Western chips, but the entire facility is powered by a 5G backbone built by an Eastern provider. Taufik is part of a generation that treats technology like a buffet. While some nations are busy banning hardware, Taufik's university and his startup are busy integrating it. I heard that his team recently won a regional math and coding competition, and they've already filed 3 patents in patent conversion cycles that are nearly 20% faster than they were just 5 years ago. Taufik doesn't care where the signal comes from, as long as it's fast enough to train his AI models. To him, strategic optionality is just common sense innovation policy. When I see these metrics, the rising patent rates, the soaring mathematical performance across Asia, I can't help but feel a bit of awe. It's a pragmatic, results-oriented world. We might be sitting here worrying about tech decoupling in the West, but for Taufik, the future is being built by soldering the best parts of two different worlds together. It's a powerful reminder that innovation doesn't follow a flag. It follows the path of least resistance and most utility.
Innovation follows the path of least resistance. That is Taufik's reality, summed up perfectly. He represents the absolute refusal to accept the splinter net.
He's treating the great power competition like a shopping mall. He goes to the NVIDIA store for the GPU, and he goes to the Huawei store for the 5G antenna, and he makes them work together.
And he's doing it because he has specific practical technical needs. Take something like liquid cooling for AI data centers.
Liquid cooling. This is literally to keep the servers from melting, right?
Yes. The new generation of AI chips run incredibly hot. Western data centers, many of which are older, are struggling to retrofit their air-cooled systems. It's a huge engineering challenge. But Chinese providers, largely because they've been building out so much new infrastructure recently, are very aggressive and very advanced in liquid cooling solutions. So if you are Taufik and you are building a new data center in a hot, humid climate like Kuala Lumpur, are you going to say, oh, I won't use the best cooling tech because of geopolitics? No, you buy the thing that works best.
And the data supports this pragmatic approach.
Yes. There are reports from firms like STL Partners that track the rollout of 5G standalone networks. And in these swing states, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, parts of Latin America, the tech stack is a hybrid. They're actively mixing Ericsson and Nokia gear with Huawei and ZTE equipment. They are resisting the immense pressure to rip and replace everything with one side's tech.
But what about the security risk? I mean, the arguments from the U.S. about backdoors and hardware aren't just made up. There are real, legitimate concerns about data privacy and state surveillance.
Absolutely, and that is driving a very interesting trend, especially in the Arab world, regarding cloud computing. There was a great report on strategic choice between cloud and on-premises in the capital market sector.
So this is for really sensitive data, like stock exchanges and central banks.
Yes. These countries want the best AI. They want the powerful analytics that Google and Microsoft and AWS offer, but they are terrified of the U.S. Cloud Act.
The Cloud Act.
It basically allows U.S. law enforcement to compel U.S.-based tech companies to hand over data, even if that data is physically stored on a server in Riyadh or Dubai.
So if I'm the Saudi Stock Exchange, I don't want the FBI to be able to subpoena my transaction records just because I happen to use Amazon's cloud services.
Exactly. They don't boycott AWS. That would be cutting off their nose to spite their face. Instead, they demand sovereign cloud solutions. They are forcing the Western tech giants to build these new hybrid models where the data can live on their servers, but the control plane, the cryptographic keys, the access controls, stays physically inside the host country. They are saying, we will buy your technology, but we will not buy your jurisdiction.
It's the same pattern all over again. Eris at the port, Pharaoh with the money, Taufik with the servers. I want your product, but I want to retain the power to say no.
And the data is becoming clear. The countries that are mastering this mix-and-match approach, the ones soldering the best of East and West together, are winning the innovation race. The patent data shows that this kind of cross-pollination leads to faster innovation cycles than technological isolation. If you limit your engineers to only using blue team tools, you are effectively fighting with one hand tied behind your back.
So we've taken a tour of the world. We've seen the physical, the economic, the financial, and now the digital layers of this new global mesh.
And when you put it all together, what we are seeing is the rise of a middle power cartel.
That sounds a little sinister.
I mean it in the purely economic sense. A group of independent actors who realize they can coordinate their actions to maximize their collective leverage against much larger players. We're talking about nations like Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey. They're all realizing that they have immense power, but only if they don't choose a side.
So they aren't anti-American, and they aren't anti-Chinese.
They are pro themselves, pro-sovereignty. Right. And they have realized that their greatest strategic asset is the threat of going to the other side.
That's the threat of exit you mentioned at the top.
Yes. When Vietnam negotiates new trade terms with the U.S., the silent shadow of China is in the room, getting them a better deal. And when Saudi Arabia negotiates oil prices with China, the U.S. security umbrella is in the room, giving them more leverage. It works both ways.
It just brings us right back to that trade attaché in the glass office I mentioned at the start. He wasn't playing a dangerous game. He was playing the only rational game available to him.
And the most ironic part of all of this, the harder the superpowers push for loyalty, the more they demand you are either with us or against us. The more they incentivize these countries to build these financial and technological fire escapes. Every new sanction creates a new customer for CIPS. Every new export control on technology creates a new market for a non-aligned tech provider. They are accelerating the very trend they're trying to stop.
We so often ask who will win the 21st century. Will it be the eagle or the dragon? But when you look at the new trade routes, the parallel payment rails, and the hybrid tech stacks, it seems the real winners might be the ones who realize they never actually had to choose. They're building a world where the ultimate superpower isn't a country. It's the ability to say no.